some words to say in a moment or two. Today is, of course, the special meeting of the City Council to deal with the city's budget. It's one of the most important days on the City Council calendar. I do want to begin my remarks by just thanking Councillor Crawford again for his incredibly hard work on the budget. He has been the budget chief for a remarkable 8 years. I'm not sure if anybody's ever done that before, but and I'm not sure if anybody'd ever want to, but he's done a remarkable job. And people will acknowledge, even people who have some different ideas than himself on the council, that he's provided steady and strong and sensitive and respectful leadership and everybody that way during the course of the budget process. And I want to extend my profound gratitude to him for that in terms of that overall leadership. I've said before that when you get to the end of the budget process, it is the end of a long journey, especially for the city staff who have worked so hard, and I commend them again for all the hard work that they've done. But I think it's also a lot of hard work for some people at the elected representative level, and that includes, of course, Councillor Crawford. It includes his own office staff, and Monique Lisi has been somebody that's worked for months now. We started in on this, as we will start for next year, probably in the month of March, because once one is finished, you start with the next one. And I want to say in my own office, there's been a team that have been working on it, but no one harder than Louis Civilis, who's has the budget file in this office. So I want to say thank you to all of those people, but especially to Councillor Gary Crawford. I strongly believe this is a good and responsible budget for the city. The 2022 budget, will continue to deliver the largest COVID-19 vaccine campaign in Canada. It will, for the first time, invest in an emotion-centered care model at city long-term care residences in order to provide the best possible care for the residents there. It will hire 62 new frontline paramedics, which will continue the city's multi-year staffing plan for Toronto Paramedic Services, which has seen hundreds of paramedics hired. It will lower small business property taxes by 15% for many, many small businesses. It will expand sidewalk snow clearing to every neighborhood across the city. And it will restore TTC service to pre-pandemic levels, while at the same time freezing transit fares. That work to ramp up TTC service started last Sunday, with 17 routes seeing increased service to restore it to the way it was before the pandemic began. Now, over the course of the budget process, because we have an entire process from the day that it's put out by the staff to today, we have worked with councillors to make sure that we're making further investments in some key areas, which you'll hear more about over the course of the meeting today. And I look forward, as mayor, and also with the budget chief, Councillor Gary Crawford, to supporting a number of additional initiatives in the budget, including the following. First, expediting the delivery of 300 additional housing opportunities for people experiencing homelessness who are currently in the shelter system. Second, supporting hospital-based violence intervention programs like the BRAVE program at Sunnybrook Hospital. Thirdly, hiring more bylaw officers to support the expansion of Rent Safe TO, a program that helps to look after the interests of tenants in apartment buildings across the city, as well as those in multi-tenant housing, and noise bylaw enforcement. So we would like to have additional licensing and standards officers to help with those areas, the Rent Safe, the multi-tenant housing, and noise enforcement. Fourthly, speeding up the elimination date of late fines for adults and teens for the Toronto Public Library system, so that that elimination can begin immediately. Something that was provided for later in the year, but by allocating some additional funds, we're able to have that decision take immediate effect. And last but not least, funding the continuation of the Oakwood Vaughan Youth Space, which is something that is going to be very important in that area of the city, something that is in place and needs to have funding for it continued. We will provide more funding support for the Strong Neighborhood Strategy and Community Partnership and Investment Program grants, something that has impact across the city, and we will provide support to the 519 Community Centre on Church Street. This is also a COVID-19 budget that recognizes the financial realities our city is facing thanks to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks to Team Toronto's vaccination efforts, I am cautiously optimistic that the progress will continue to full reopening, to a full and robust economic recovery this year. And that is one of the key challenges that I'm focusing on as mayor, is that full economic recovery that will restore us to a position that is stronger than ever, as I very much like to say and very much believe is possible. Our finances will improve as we get Toronto back to the office and back on transit. But for now, continued careful management and solid government partnerships are more necessary than ever. We've worked to make sure this is a responsible budget that makes sure Toronto can get through the end of the pandemic and does, in fact, come back stronger than ever. As the budget notes, the city itself has worked to find $1.6 billion in efficiencies and savings and offsets and other measures over the course of the pandemic, $500 million in this budget alone. That was our responsibility to do, and we have done it. We worked throughout the pandemic with the Government of Canada and with the Government of Ontario to protect services, to invest in crucial areas that need it, and to keep costs affordable. We're grateful for their partnership, the other governments, their financial support, and their recognition that cities do not have the legal latitude, do not have the means at their disposal to deal with an unprecedented loss of revenue like we've experienced and some of the increased costs that are related to the pandemic. I've been working hard to secure continued emergency COVID-19 support from both the provincial and federal governments for the City of Toronto and for cities across Canada. But of course, my primary responsibility is to our own city. To protect frontline services and our ongoing recovery, this budget makes it clear that Toronto needs a further $1.4 billion in overall COVID-19 relief funding this year from the other orders of government, so that we can continue providing frontline essential services without cuts, so that we can avoid slashing the city's capital budget, which in turn would jeopardize construction, jobs, and economic recovery. Much of this shortfall, and I hasten to make this very clear, this is not about going after other governments for operating funding for the TTC, as much as I believe both of those governments, consistent with what happens in other countries, should be supportive of the operations of this huge transit system in the country's economic engine. This is not about that. This is about a revenue shortfall of forecasted at $561 million that caused us to lose transit revenue because of dramatically reduced ridership levels during the course of the pandemic. People not going to work and working remotely. Of course, that meant people were not on transit, which meant we didn't have the money they would have paid for their fare on virtually a daily basis, if not twice a day. I welcome and thank the provincial government for officially recognizing this week both the need for the governments, federal and provincial, to continue contributing to transit systems to bridge this COVID-19 related transit revenue gap, and for stepping forward to actually make an initial commitment in that regard. And I thank Minister Caroline Mulroney, as well as Premier Ford and Finance Minister Bethlenfalvy, for this initial commitment by the Government of Ontario and the recognition that they articulated at that time for the need for all three governments to sit together and work through this challenge. This provincial announcement represented an important step forward in the 2022 budget, and I hope that both governments quickly come to an agreement, meaning the federal and provincial governments, to continue doing what they have done throughout the pandemic, and I acknowledge that right here and now, namely to recognize the need for continued transit support in the wake of dramatically reduced ridership, and as well to look at the other areas where we've been put into a position of having to incur substantially increased expenditures, especially in areas such as shelter and homelessness because of the COVID-19 pandemic. My advocacy will continue beyond today's budget approval that I'm hopeful for and anticipating, as it did last year. But I am determined to ensure that we protect frontline services and continue to make needed investments in major capital projects and ongoing capital requirements of the city, which also create a lot of jobs. This is about protecting thousands of needed construction industry jobs in the City of Toronto, the city forward in terms of its capital infrastructure. A reduction in capital expenditures and funding intended for capital infrastructure investments would have a serious impact on job growth. $1.4 billion reduced capital expenditure, for example, would be expected to impact 12,600 jobs, mainly in construction. That would hurt the construction industry. It would hurt the Toronto and Ontario and Canadian economies, and it would hurt other people beyond that at a time when we should be doing all that we can to help these industries, to help the economy, and to preserve and create jobs, not lose them. We need those jobs now. We need those projects now, and that is the argument that I have been taking forward and will continue to take forward. And I am very optimistic that the other governments will see the wisdom, as they've begun to see so far, in helping to build Toronto back and to make sure that we can emerge from this pandemic stronger than ever. Any of the projects that would have to be cut are needed infrastructure upgrades for the good of transit and our environment. We should be making these investments so that we can continue to address climate change, for example, and to improve the infrastructure in a growing city whose population continues to grow. That is another goal, that climate change, adapting to growth, putting proper infrastructure in place that I believe all governments share. And that is why this COVID-19 support from other governments delivered in a timely manner is very, very important to our city and to its economic future. I'm confident that the other governments will ultimately come through, as the province positively indicated this week, because they understand the pandemic has continued into this year and that cities simply do not have the financial resources or abilities to look after this kind of unprecedented strain. So I look forward to the discussion at City Council today. It's always an interesting meeting where lots of different opinions and perspectives are shared, and I welcome that as being something that's very healthy in our very healthy civic democracy. And on that note, I would now like to ask Councillor Crawford, with again thanks for his superb effort as the budget chief for the city, to make a few remarks on this important day.
Thank you, Mayor Tory, and good morning to everybody. I'm looking forward to today's City Council meeting, where we're going to be considering and finalizing the 2022 operating and capital budgets for the city. As the Mayor mentioned, I've been around for more than a few budget cycles as the chair of the Budget Committee. But the last 3 years of city budgets have been unlike any other in the past 8 years, and frankly, beyond that. The challenges of preparing a budget shaped by constantly changing circumstances of a pandemic and its associated financial realities and unknowns has been significant. In addition, the 2022 budget challenges were heightened with the unexpected pressures of Omicron variant presented very late in the process. That actually added $200 million pressure on the existing financial burdens. But in spite of this budget is responsible, it is responsive, and it is thoughtful. It protects existing services, it prioritizes investments, it takes care of the residents of the City of Toronto, and it supports economic recovery. And it begins to manage the city's long-term financial sustainability and resiliency. And as the Mayor mentioned earlier, we are confident that the city's finances will improve. Now, the support and partnerships with the federal and provincial governments, both to protect services and to invest in crucial areas in response to this unprecedented revenue loss for the city, has suffered during this extraordinary period of time. And this is critical. This year alone, we require $1.4 billion to ensure we don't cut services or slash our capital plan. That, of course, is going to jeopardize jobs. At this point, I'd like to thank the members of the Budget Committee for the commitment, their diligence, as well as my other colleagues on council who have participated and remained engaged throughout this process. As the Mayor mentioned, this is a long process. It's a year-long process, and there's a lot of people who have been involved in the city budget. And of course, city staff, just for their keen analysis, their unshakable resolve, and quite frankly, the heroic work in preparing this budget and the last couple. And of course, I want to thank the residents and groups from across the city for their participation and input that has truly contributed to shaping what we have before us today. I would also like to express my gratitude in advance to my fellow councillors for being mindful of where we are today and the decisions that need to be made to ensure that Toronto will make it through this pandemic stronger than ever. And of course, Mayor Tory, I want to thank you very much. I want to thank you for your leadership and for the care that you have taken in this city, for your vision, your compassion, and for all your contributions in keeping the city, or residents of the City of Toronto, especially the last 2 years, healthy and safe. Thank you for very much your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Crawford and Mayor Tory. We'll now take questions from the media. As a reminder, it's one question, one follow-up, and we'll unmute you when it's your turn. First up, we have Felipe from Radio Canada. Go ahead.
Mayor Tory, so you mentioned cutting, infrastructure upgrades related to climate change. Do you have concrete examples of what's on the chopping block, and would those cuts be setting us back as a city, as you've mentioned, they're critical infrastructure that should be built in the next few years for the decades to come? So, do you have concrete examples of what's on the chopping block, and would those be setting us back as a city?
while I'm very hopeful that we won't have to use this list because the other governments will come forward with the amount of assistance that's needed to avoid any of these kinds of capital cuts, we're working on that list because obviously we would have to have one available if we were called upon to use it. I will just tell you that at the moment, the categories that would be affected are somewhat obvious, say when it comes to things that would affect our climate change goals, which are very ambitious. And so we have to move ahead. Anything we do by definition that slows down the achievement of our climate change goals is going to do just that, is going to impede our progress on something that the council considers to be very important. So whether it's the purchase of electric buses or whether it's the retrofitting of buildings to make them more energy efficient or a host of things like that that could be scaled back, postponed, cut back as a result of failure to achieve the support from the other governments, these are things that would have a meaningful impact on the city in the shorter term and would obviously slow down the achievement of things like our climate change goals. So that list is not yet in public hands. I haven't even seen it yet, but that's the kind of thing that we know. Transit, transportation, and parks and recreation types of projects that would have to be postponed, scaled back, or canceled.
Yeah. Slightly different topic. Well, completely different topic. Police was asking for nearly $25 million more, something that you've already supported publicly. But I guess how do you justify, adding to the police budget when there are Torontonians and even city councillors who are calling for a reduction in the police budget and for looking at policing alternatives?
There was nothing we spent more time on this year as a big element of the overall city budget than taking a look at the police budget. Their initial request was for funds in addition to what has been recommended in the budget before council today. 96% of what is being given by way of an increase on the budget is going to simply pay the costs of the previously negotiated collective bargaining agreement with the police officers and civilians who are paid under that contract. I would just say that over the course of my time as mayor, there have been 3 police budgets which have been at a 0% increase, and the overall increase spread across the 8 years has been very modest indeed. And I think that those who advocate an arbitrary cut to the police budget are out of touch with the requirements that exist in a growing city to make sure that we can keep that city safe. I even look at all the activities and the very successful deployment of police officers and other resources in the last couple of weekends to keep the city safe as a good example of that. I look at the requests that I have on my desk by email from councillors from across the city asking for more police officers. And I look at the fact that beyond the increase necessary to fund the collective bargaining agreement, the police have managed to find within their budget the room to increase the neighborhood officer program, the room to put the resources in place to properly look after missing persons, which is something of keen interest in the wake of some of the events that happened in the city, the room to double the resources of our hate crime unit, because that's something that's been of great concern across the city, the room to increase the resources we apply to things like traffic enforcement, which is of concern to many people. And I just look at, the things that challenge our police officers and say that they need to be supported in keeping the city safe. And I'll say one more thing. They are hard at work, as we are, bringing about very significant reforms in the way policing is done in this city. And that will reflect itself over time in adjustments that can be made to the budget. But I can just assure you that the commitment to reform on the part of the City Council, where we've introduced, for example, the crisis response program that's led by mental health professionals and civilians, which is going to be a leader in terms of the way it does its work in North America, and things like that are continuing apace, and that I think people should have the patience with the changes we're going to make over time to make sure that that we carry out policing in the most sensitive, appropriate manner, but that we also have an eye to the budget and where that budget is invested and by whom.
Thank you. Next up, we have Jennifer Pagliaro from the Star. Go ahead.
Good morning, Mayor. Good morning, Councillor. I wanted to ask about the other governments. Obviously, we got some good news from the province about transit funding. Obviously, still waiting to see if it will be allocated fully towards the TTC. It seems like it probably will based on ridership. But wondering now what conversations are happening heading into kind of this deadline we've set today for balancing the budget. I know we've balanced the budget on paper in the past and waited for the restart money to come in, but we don't have any assurances that it will. And I know we've heard from staff about some timelines on some of those capital projects. So I'm just wondering about the urgency being relayed to the other governments at this point, given that the vote is now hours away.
The other governments were aware of today being the budget day. They were also aware, as you alluded to, that the money actually being in hand was something that wasn't the case last year on budget day, but we had to have some degree of assurance that it was forthcoming. The announcement from the provincial government this week was a very solid step forward in that regard, with more discussions still ongoing with them in regard to the other part of the money that is not related to transit. The discussions with the federal government continue. I've had multiple discussions with people, including the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, and other ministers, the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. And those discussions took place as recently as yesterday. And I'm, again, cautiously optimistic that they will bear fruit. I think we might hear something in the next very short period of time. But all the things we've heard from the province, from the federal government, will be representative of what is a work in progress. We're going to have to keep at this. I'm going to keep at this. It's a major responsibility that rests with me principally. And I will just encourage my colleagues today to be supportive of those efforts and to join me in making sure that we advocate to the governments as to this need and what brought it about, which is COVID-19. And I'm, again, cautiously optimistic that a satisfactory result will ensue.
And I just wanted to pivot to the gun violence issue. I know we talked last time when we were doing a budget press conference about the Sunnybrook program and Brave. There's obviously been ongoing violence, especially with incredibly young people. And I just wonder if there's any further conversation with the province or the federal government, especially, given the province's responsibility for schools and healthcare, just given the need that the city has. And again, wondering about the funds the federal government promised during the election. I know you've been on their case about that, but we haven't seen any of that materialize.
Well, to be candid, I think, as you know, because I would have been, you would have been among the first people we would have told if they were forthcoming, because you've asked so, continuously, and so have I. Those funds are not yet forthcoming, but they were the subject of such a firm and precise commitment during the course of the recent election campaign that I'm confident from the federal government they will be forthcoming. I will say there are other discussions that have taken place. Let's remember the Safe TO plan that we've put forward, which I think really gives us a tremendous opportunity to deal with the prevention aspects of crime in the community, especially as regards young people. And with all the forces gathered together at a table, the school board, the city itself, the police, the people like the United Way and other community organizations, I think gives us a real chance to get at some of these things we see happening that are so horrifying and tragic before they happen. And but we're going to need help with that. And it's interesting because the Safe TO program was something that we were required to put in place, a program like that, by provincial legislation. And so I think what goes with that is a responsibility to help us with the financing of those programs as we go forward. For this year, we have made an allocation in the city's budget to finance the beginnings of that program, year 1 of 10, I believe. But we're certainly looking to the other governments to help us with this, because we believe that rather than spending all the money we are on reacting to these kinds of events, we should be spending more money addressing them before they happen and addressing some of the root causes. And so that's as well an ongoing piece of work. But I'm very pleased at the fact that we have been able to initiate something like Safe TO, which is in the budget, is funded, and will proceed this year. And that I think those kinds of initiatives will help us in the battle against gun violence and other kinds of crime in some places where it's very prevalent.
Thank you. And next up, we have Momin Qureshi from City News Toronto. Go ahead.
Morning. Thank you for taking my question. Mayor Tory, again about the $1.4 billion. I know that the hope is that it'll come from the federal and provincial governments fairly soon, but it seems like the last few years specifically, there's been a big ask from those two upper levels of government. I just want to know, even if they do come through with the funding, is there a point where the city has to consider trying to make things more sustainable themselves via and some other way, whether it's revenue tools or something else?
Well, let's be very clear. I don't think that the present resources and tools put into the hands of city governments generally right across Ontario are adequate or reflective of the role that we play in delivering services, or of the reality of Toronto, Ontario, and Canada in 2022, let alone 1867, which is when a lot of this stuff was put in place. I think we need to have a complete rethink of that, and that is something I've been saying throughout, but it's sometimes difficult to get people to sit down and have that kind of discussion. I'm not talking about amending the Constitution, by the way. I'm just talking about the actual realities of who delivers services. The pandemic has shown very clearly that when it comes to relying on delivering of services at a local level to individual people, families, neighborhoods, streets, buildings, it's the city. in conjunction with community organizations that does that. And that's no offense to the other governments. That's just the reality of the government that is closest to the people and can most effectively deliver those kinds of services. And yet we don't have the resources to deal with those kinds of challenges, not just during a pandemic, but any time. Now, with respect to the particular asks of the last couple of years, let's be very clear on something. All of these asks, including the 1.4 billion this year, are not because we're spending too much money, or not because we're not controlling our expenses, or not because we haven't taken every bit of revenue that we can get from the system that we have in place to serve our needs. It is because of the extraordinary impact of the pandemic. The entire 1.4 billion is representative of shortfall in transit revenue because people have not been using the transit system in the same numbers, and the extraordinary expenses we've been put to keep people safe in places like our shelter system. And so I think those are not the mark of a government that's not sustainable, or a financial practice that isn't, capable and responsible. It is the mark of an extraordinary circumstance. I can't help but to comment on this. I see people saying that, the budget didn't have any ambition. And I just smile to myself and say that, those people as well, I think with respect, are out of touch with the assignment we faced this year. I saw in the Toronto Star, it made reference to a house that maybe has some danger of seeing the roof cave in. I compared it, in the way I would articulate it to people, as being a ship that was in very heavy seas because of a huge storm called a pandemic. And that the ambition we had, which I think was a laudable ambition that would be shared by the public, was to safely get the ship to shore, to get this city through the pandemic in safe hands, without cutting services, being able to provide the supports people needed. That's what the ambition was. And that's been the ambition for the last couple of years. And if I may say so myself, I think the city has done very well, backed up by the credit rating agencies that say, notwithstanding that we didn't cut services, we didn't have to unduly raise taxes, we didn't have to alter unduly our debt structure, that we are in sound financial shape and people have been cared for and supported during the pandemic. And so we will continue to do that. I read these articles with interest. I smile because, I have, together with Councillor Crawford and the others, the actual responsibility of having to deliver a budget and having to make sure we keep services and that we keep taxes as low as we can, because there's a lot of people that are struggling out there right now. We can't have it both ways. And so that is the budget we'll be considering today. But the root cause of the $1.4 billion shortfall is the extraordinary circumstance, those heavy winds and the high seas that we're facing, as a city because of the pandemic entirely.
And sir, if I could just ask a follow-up about something completely different. We saw another incident on the TTC yesterday with a stabbing. There was a shooting earlier this week. There was another one last week where all the suspects appear to be very young teenagers, and that's rightfully making a lot of people concerned. I just wanted to get your take on it. And is that an anomaly, or is there a real problem in this city of what's happening with the younger set?
Well, let's be frank. Any violence that takes place, whether it's a stabbing or a shooting or any of these other kinds of incidents, are representative of a problem that is in the city. This is still a very safe city relative to many others across the world and across North America. But we've got to look at this, as we're doing, in a very concentrated manner. And the facts are that it isn't just a series of isolated incidents. The trends over the last couple of years indicate that some of the accused in these incidents are getting younger and younger, as are some of the victims. And that is deeply concerning. I think the SafeTO initiative will help address that. I have spoken to the chief. I spoke to the director of the school board. For that matter, I spoke to the senior executives of the transit union, because, again, there have been 2 incidents of that kind involving operators on our transit system. And all of these things are getting our very concentrated attention. We're going to be continuing to try to get the concentrated attention of the other governments who have been helpful on some of these matters. But it is something that is very much focused on a challenge that we face, and it is a problem that is of deep concern to me, and I know to the members of council and to the city government. We won't be able to solve that problem alone. It's a complex problem. There isn't any easy answer to the question of saying, well, how did a 14-year-old get his hands on a gun, decide to put it in his pocket, and then decide to use it? And those are 3 separate questions, but they're profoundly troubling questions that you should have to ask them. But we're asking them now and trying to come to grips with this, and there's not a simple answer to it, but we're working at it in a very determined way.
Okay, that's it for today, everybody. Thank you and have
Thanks
a great
very
rest of your day.